Well, hello. So today I have a couple recordings of Lore Master points of view of mine on Tier 4 Boss 2. So I wanted to put together a video that would talk about how to play Lore Master on Boss 2 of Hiddenhoard of Amnangara. So, as we go through this, I'm going to have 4 tips for you. This recording that we have here is with a light oil composition. So we have a yellow-red mini applying the light debuff on targets. And that leads to our first major tip. To play Lore Master on this fight, you need to know your comp, whether you're light oil or fire oil. Since we're light oil, that means I have a damage dealer that does tactical damage, in particular the Minstrel, which is why I threw that warding lore circle down where the boss is going to be. In a light oil comp, you need to know which debuffs you're going to use. It's basically Bear helps, Boglurker helps, Raven does not help since that's fire mitigation. Tar does not help since that's fire mitigation. The Windlore debuff stacks up for extra incoming damage. Ancient Craft adds a lot of mitigation reduction. So Bear, Boglurker, Ancient Craft, Windlore are really your debuffs that you're using for damage here. Alright, let's go look at the other one. Let's look at the fire oil comp now. Fire oil plays very differently. In Fire Oil, you need to bring the Raven out, because that's going to give a fire mitigation debuff, and you're going to have to use Sticky Tar for the damage, because that's another minus 10% fire mitigation. If we jump into this fight, we're going to have to open with Raven on Catmint. Why would I do that? Catmint actually doubles the mitigation debuff of Benediction of the Raven from the Raven. So we're using that to get minus 20% fire mitigation instead of minus 10%. Since Benediction of the Raven lasts 60 seconds, and since Catmint has a cooldown of 45 seconds, you can keep this up with 100% uptime on a target. Also note, Benediction of the Raven is actually an AoE skill. A lot of people seem to forget this when they do their sort of theory crafting to compare Benediction to other comps. In the ad waves, we're going to use Benediction of the Raven to hit as many targets as possible to get that minus 10 or minus 20% fire mid, depending on what it is at the time, on as many targets as possible. Same with Ancient Craft, also AoE, we want to get that on as many targets as possible. So here, opening is going to be a Raven and Ancient Craft with your lures. That leads into tip 2. Once you know your comp, once you know which debuffs you're going to apply, which with Fire Oil you still apply Bear and Boglurker, by the way, you need to maintain your debuffs. I say debuffs and not buffs. Why is this? A buff is something that you apply that positively affects your other players in the raid. Lore Masters really don't do that. They're a debuffing class. Instead, we apply debuffs on targets, which means that anyone, regardless of which fellowship they're in, even theoretically if they weren't even in your raid, would benefit from that debuff because the debuff is applied to the target, not to your fellowship, not to your group. So you have to maintain your debuffs. You want to maintain Fire Lore, Frost Lore, Wind Lore on as many targets as possible. You maintain your damage debuffs from your pets, from Ancient Craft, from Sticky Tar, from Warding Lore, which we're not using in a Fire Oil comp since we only have Hunters and no tactical damage. Yeah, you want to maintain Sign of Power Command and Sign of Power CLNs on the boss if possible, and stuff like that. Alright, so that's tip 1, know your comp. Tip 2, maintain your debuffs. Third is you want to plan how to use your special skills. What do I mean by that? I mean primarily your cooldowns that are longer, so Ancient Craft and Tar. Tar has 2 uses. Anything in Tar has minus 10% fire mitigation, so in a Fire Oil composition like this one, you want to use it as much as possible for that damage debuff that increases the damage your team is doing. However, it also is a 50% slow, which means you can also use it to CC an area, particularly when we come into phase 2 with the Whelplings. That CC weight might actually outweigh the usefulness of Tar as a damage debuff. So you'll see here, the way I placed the Tar is kind of in the middle of the room, slightly toward the side the DPS was going to kill first. The reason for that is we can model the cold whelplings moving around the world kind of like particles bouncing around an ideal gas. They basically bounce around randomly. If you throw the tar right in the middle of where they're going to be bouncing around, you're going to slow them down in the middle of where they bounce around. That increases the probability that they start grouping up. Once they group up, you can start doing other things to them like CC, Ancient Craft, Benediction of the Raven, so that you hold them in place or increase damage on them. So using tar for CC is important in how to know how to use your special skills. Ancient Craft you generally want to be using off cooldown. It's a really big buff to damage because it's a really strong debuff to armor. With a 60-second cooldown though, there are certain times you need to be aware not to use it. So if you're just about to go into the hide phases, that might not be the time to use AC on boss, since some of that time will be wasted as you hide and he's green barred. Similarly, you want to make sure you open the chain phase towards the end of the fight with Ancient Craft, so you might want to hold off a little bit on it to make sure that you apply it right as he heals to 40% on tier 3 or 50% on tier 4. Our final tip is you need to keep up your CC by having a CC plan. And I'm going to use this recording from the Fire Oil comp to illustrate my CC plan for each phase. In the first phase, we're really only going to hold these 2 black arrows on the CC side. It doesn't matter too much which one you start with. Some Guardians prefer you start with the north one because that's the one that's more likely to run around the pillar and start shooting at the Guardian. But basically you use Blinding Flash to Mez 1. And on phase 1, I actually wait a couple seconds and do other things. In this case, I'm using Ancient Master and Lore to get them on ads before using Test of Will on the other black arrow. That Test of Will just holds that black arrow out until Blinding Flash comes off cooldown, and then I'll be holding that one with a Mez as well. Then I have to be sure to alternate which ones I Blinding Flash and use the skill as soon as it comes off CD to minimize the amount of time that it's not holding the black arrow. Blinding Flash has a 15-second cooldown and lasts for 30 seconds, but because of the animation time involved in it and the time of the travel from the projectile to target, that can result in the black arrows being awake very briefly between mezzes when you're holding 2. Another important point for phase 1 and phase 3 is that your burglar is going to do a startling twist on these warriors to remove the corruptions. Startling twist applies a stun. That stun is free time for your DPS to hit them. You want to be able to lengthen the time of that stun by chaining Bane-flare immediately after that stun ends. Alright, that's phase 1. The next phase we want to look at is phase 2. I already mentioned how I use tar to try to slow whelplings and group them up, but what are some other things we do on phase 2? Some groups do CC on the worms, but honestly, CC on the worms is something I've only seen do when you're trying to make up for weaknesses from the Guardian's play. On tier 3 and tier 4, I'm usually not bringing a Guardian I don't trust, so I'm not CCing the worms. We put our tar down for CC. Make sure we get our damage buffs on the Frost Color target when he spawns. After that, we want to make sure we get appropriate lures on as many targets as possible, but then we're watching Whelplings. If Whelplings happen to bunch up in place, that would be a good time to cast Herblore. Herblore is going to hold them in place for 30 seconds because it's a long route. Once it's Herblored, and you have a grouping, you can actually call your DPS that it's time to switch to Whelplings. Once they start hitting it, you can use Bane-flare to hold them in place for more time, and the burglar can use Startling Twist to keep the group grouped up so you can AoE Whelplings down. As you see, we haven't had this opportunity show yet. I Herblore several of them just to kind of keep their puddles dropped away from group. Since DPS is on worms, and since the whelplings aren't really all together, I'm not doing a Bane-flare yet. I'm waiting for a good opportunity. On some pulls, you never really get that opportunity. If I can get closer to the burglar here, we might have an opportunity for a Bane-flare. Here's an opportunity for a Bane-flare. I use Wisdom of the Council to save myself leaving puddles. I've called DPS to switch to them, and that's what they do. They start AoEing Whelplings down based on where I Bane-flared. After that, you have other skills that will hold things in place, so I start mixing in my stuns and my blinding flash to try to hold things in place as long as possible. Or, you know, consider other priorities like refreshing lores on boss and getting debuffs on the worm. That really is phase 2. With that, we can kind of skip to phase 3. I use a different CC plan for phase 3 than phase 1 now. You can always use the same blinding flash into wait a little bit, into test of will on the other black arrow, into blinding flash on that black arrow like I did on phase 1. However, on phase 3, if a player gets the red eye and is being chased by warriors, black arrows will also shoot at that player. Squishier players like hunters can die pretty quickly if they have multiple black arrows that are shooting at them even with just normal attacks on tier 4. So I use a slightly different approach to try to minimize the chance that this happens. I blinding flash one black arrow, use Call to the Valor to reset the CC, and then immediately blinding flash the other. As long as I alternate blinding flash off cooldown, that will hold the arrows as long as I need to hold them. Of course, it's just as important to make sure you're getting your pet damage debuffs on TA targets as fast as possible, and keeping lures on boss and as many other ads as you can. That's what you do with your time while blinding flashes on CC. There are other ways to do this CC as well. For example, I've seen Perks 115 actually mezzes a BA on kill side, that's not the TA, then runs to the other side and uses Bane-flare to hold the other 2 black arrows on the CC side. But this requires a different group and different kill order than we're using in this video or in my light oil video. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend you do that without talking that out with your group first. Now, chain phase isn't too different for the Lore Master than the other phases, but I'm going to go to my light oil video and show you some of the differences after I show you what we do on this one. So in chain phase, it's very important that we debuff the chain so that those actually get more damage on them. Let's actually go to the heal so I can demonstrate that better. He's going to heal at 20% up to 50%. If this were a tier 3 pull, the first chain we would hit is the chain that's currently above the boss. However, because this is tier 4, the boss drops puddles on the tank that they really can't stand in. Tanks can't stand in. So we actually slowly move the boss over across the room. So the first chain we're going to hit is actually currently behind me. That chain we need to debuff. So we apply Benediction of the Raven, and we apply Root Strike. And if I'm good, we'll also make sure to apply a Windlore to it for extra incoming damage when the hunters switch to it. And that's really it. You keep making sure that you have all your debuffs on the boss. You prep the chain that hunters are going to switch to, and then refresh Root Strike if that falls off, and let your hunters do your job. Now, switching over to the light oil version. On this chain phase, let's find the beginning of the chain phase here. On this chain phase, because it's a light oil comp, I'm really only going to use Root Strike and Windlore to debuff chains, which gives me more time to do other things. In particular, you could use the Bear Taunt to save some of the TPS on the tanks. By positioning yourself, and I'll actually fail at this the first time I do it if I recall it correctly, by positioning yourself away from group, using your bear, and using its taunt. I guess I don't do it with this bear yet, do I? Yeah, no, I do it with the next bear I summon. But using the bear taunt while standing away from group forces the boss to run away from tanks, kill your bear, and then run back to tanks. That buys a lot of time for your tanks to just not take damage, which helps you guarantee that they survive and therefore live. Now, here I get frontaled by the boss, and that's because I basically run too slowly away from where the bear is going to be when the boss hits him. So on subsequent times I bear taunt, you're going to see a better way to bear taunt so that you don't get hit. on this pull, I primarily wait until around the time hunters switch to chain to start using bear taunt. The reason for that is that's when the boss is more tiered up and is doing more damage, so we're getting more value out of that bear taunt by taking bigger hits off of our tanks. As soon as you hit your bear taunt, you want to be running away. Which I'm waiting for them to really start chain. And here I bear taunt and I make sure I'm running away from the bear so that there's no chance I get frontaled. The other skill to be aware of is if you have a 4-set for Lore Master already, you really want to use the fact that Power of Knowledge reduces damage. When the boss is high tiered up, so when the chain's about to come down, that's a good time to use that laser to get 5.5 seconds of reduced damage from the boss. I didn't do that on this chain, but I think I do it on the next chain, so let's take a look. This is pretty further along than I thought it was. Okay, I basically bear taunt instead of laser on this pull. Let's switch back to the fire oil boil. On the fire oil pull, I'm generally more careful not to use bear taunt when the chain is less than 50%. Instead, I use that time to laser to reduce the damage the boss is doing by 20%. This will not reduce the damage of the chain falling on top of the tanks, but hopefully by reducing boss damage, it's a little bit easier for the tanks to use their other cooldowns and healers to use their other cooldowns to keep the tanks up. Another good time to use laser on this boss fight is when you run back from hide. Usually when you run back from hide, a single tank is going to take that first hit. That's going to be the hit that reapplies Maul, so that's actually a big hit from the boss. So we hide. After hammer down, we run back, and then we get ready to apply the laser to reduce the damage that our tank takes on that first hit. Just like that, except if you're gonna switch mini into tank group, do it more smoothly than I did on this pull. That said, that's really it. Those are my tips for how you do Boss 2 on the Hiddenhoard of Abnakara through LM. You need to know your comp, maintain your debuffs, plan how to use your special skills, and keep up your crowd control. Thanks for watching.